Hello everyone. Welcome back to the final meeting of the Mead evaluation class in preparation for the BJCP Mead exam. In this last meeting of the course, we will talk about troubleshooting Mead. We will go throughout all flavors of Mead, and we'll see their causes and how to control them. As you can see, this is the last meeting of our Mead evaluation course. And without further ado, this is the outline of today's presentation. We'll first remember about troubleshooting and feedback, what we're supposed to do, and then we'll go through all of the common off flavors of Mead. Let's get back to the definition of what is evaluation. So evaluation is a systematic, structured assessment of something or a determination of merit, worth, or significance against a set of standards. So we must not forget that not all the meads we're going to judge in a competition are well made. And a good mead judge should have the ability to identify, describe, and diagnose common problems in mead, and also to provide feedback to the mead maker on how to solve these problems. So also we must not forget that we should not become fault finders, but only acknowledge faults that are indeed there. So to give feedback for improvement, we need to understand the off flavors and flavors that can be in a mead, and how we can control these flavors to better balance the mead and create a better mead to offer the feedback to the mead maker. So next, without further ado, we'll go on to common off flavors in mead. We're going to do the off flavors by the alphabet. So we'll start with acetaldehyde. Acetaldehyde is a colorless volatile liquid, which is obtained by oxidizing ethanol. If you know the yeast metabolism pathway, then it's basically the molecule that comes before ethanol. So how is it perceived? It's perceived as an aroma of fresh cut green apples, green grass, green leaves, or latex paint. The causes are removing the mead prematurely from the yeast. So basically the yeast creates acetaldehyde during their metabolism, and then they turn it into ethanol. And if we don't let the yeast finish up cleaning all of the mead, we will be stuck with ethanol that they haven't gotten the chance to actually convert into ethanol. Bacterial infection can create a lot of acetaldehyde, especially with Ximomonas and Acetobacter. Inadequate must oxidation before fermentation can also create a lot of acetaldehyde because of yeast problems, and also post-fermentation, which can convert ethanol back into acetaldehyde. To control, so acetaldehyde is normally reduced to ethanol by the yeast. So leave the mead on the yeast until fermentation is stopped, and oxygenate the wort thoroughly before fermentation, and avoid splashing during transfers to not introduce any oxidation into the mead post-fermentation. So that's about acetaldehyde. The next flavor we'll talk about is acetic. So the definition is acetic acid. We're not talking about acidic, we're talking about acetic. So how is it perceived? It's perceived as a sharp sourness, vinegary aroma and flavor. The causes are Acetobacter infection, along with oxygen exposure. Acetobacter will turn ethanol into acetic acid when it has oxygen. To control, we need to check the process for sources of infection. We need to check health, purity of the yeast strain, and we need to check for post-fermentation oxygen sources. So even if we have a contamination and we don't have oxygen, we will not get the acidic aroma and flavor. Check sanitation of post-fermentation and ingredients. So basically it's a sanitation problem and oxygen exposure problem. So this is for acidic, and the next flavor we're going to discuss is sour or acidic. So this is defined as having low pH in the mead. It's perceived as tart, sour, and it's a basic taste sensation. And it's often with an indication of a tart sharpness in the aroma. So it can be caused by acid additions, especially citric acid. Acid level in the honey can be too much. The use of the fruit and infection can all cause the mead to be too sour or acidic. To control it, check the level of acid additions, check acid levels in honey, check the acid levels in any fruit used. Some fruits can have a higher acidity than others, like blueberries, for example. Unripe fruit will also have higher acidities than ripe fruits. Check for infection, particularly for lactobacillus infection. Check the sweetness levels and attenuation. An over attenuated mead can seem more acidic if less sweetness is there to balance it. So these are all of the causes for acidic, for sour and acidic flavor. The next flavor we're going to discuss is alcoholic. So the definition is ethanol and higher alcohols. It's perceived as hot, spicy, vinous aromas and flavors, or it can be warming or burning mouthfeel and in the aftertaste, and it can offer increased bitterness. The causes are too warm fermentation, insufficient aging and conditioning, unhealthy fermentation, like yeast without enough nutrients or oxygen, or enough yeast, too high starting gravity, or too many fermentables that are added, or over attenuation, or it can even be from an infection. To control, lower the fermentation temperature, let the mead age longer before consuming it, use less fermentables, use a less attenuative yeast strain, check for the yeast health, use sufficient yeast nutrients, check for possible infection, which could have caused more attenuation, and also stabilize the mead to prevent further fermentation. So this is for an alcoholic flavor. Next, we'll talk about cardboard. Cardboard or wet cardboard or wet paper, as these are all signs of oxidation. It's perceived usually as stale, papery, wet cardboard aroma and flavor. The causes are post-fermentation exposure to oxygen in a mead. The controls, we need to prevent oxygen, so check how can oxygen be introduced into the mead post-fermentation. Don't splash when racking or bottling. Check caps and or keg seals for a good fit. Purge bottles and kegs with CO2 before bottling, and store the mead cool, and drink the mead when it's fresh. So this is for cardboard oxidation. And the next off flavor we can have in a mead is chemical off flavor. This is defined as the presence of chemicals above a taste threshold. It's perceived as a chemical like vitamins, nutrient flavors, possibly with some bitterness or saltiness. It's usually caused from excess of yeast nutrients or from contaminated water. And to control it, we need to use less nutrient additions, check the purity and cleanliness of your water source, and check the use of some cleaning compounds that you may be using to clean your equipment. So that's for the chemical off the chemical off flavor. The next flavor, the next, I'm sorry, it's not an off flavor, but it's a common problem in mead. It's more of it's an appearance problem. It's when the mead is cloudy. So the definition that it's obscured with visible particles and it can be of any source. It will be perceived as hazy appearance, obscuring particles, floating flakes inside the mead, or anything else that can obscure the appearance of the mead. It's usually caused by yeast that are remaining in suspension, under fermented honey, clarifiers that are not working completely, or even pectin haze if we used fruit. So to control, we need to find the mead with clarifying agents, troubleshoot stock fermentation, try different clarifying agents, and allow sufficient time for clarifying. That's for the cloudy appearance and how to fix it. And then we're going to move on to sweet. I know that S is not now, but you'll understand in a moment why we're talking about sweet now. So sweet is the basic taste associated with sugar or honey. Too much sweetness is referred to as a syrupy or cloying quality. So if it's too sweet, then it will be perceived as sugary or honey-like flavor and aroma. The causes are high original gravity, incomplete fermentation, or low attenuation. And some honey varieties will have higher perceived sweetness than others. So to control, we can use less honey, encourage a more complete fermentation, aim for a lower finishing gravity, and try another honey varieties, and try other honey varieties. So after sweet, we're moving on to cloying. So cloying is defined as excessive sweetness that doesn't have enough acidity or tannin to balance it, okay? So it's perceived as overly sweet, a syrupy flavor, really heavy body, tongue coating mouthfeel, a lack of acidity or tannin in the flavor, or sometimes it's accompanied with a raw honey flavor, but this isn't required. The causes are incomplete fermentation, not enough acid or tannins to balance the sweetness. And to control, we need to ferment more completely, so troubleshoot fermentation problems, use less honey or sugary agents, and add balancing acid and or tannin. This is for when you have a cloying sensation. And the next flavor we're going to talk about is diacetyl. So diacetyl is defined as a butter-like character. It's perceived as artificial butter, butterscotch or toffee-like aroma in the taste, and it can have an optional sleekness on the tongue. The causes are prematuring the mead from the yeast, low free amino nitrogen levels, which are yeast nutrients. Lactic acid bacteria can also cause it. So basically, diacetyl is another substance that the yeast produce and that they clean at the end of fermentation. So if we separate the mead from the yeast, we don't give the yeast the opportunity to clean that diacetyl, and we will be stuck with a lot of diacetyl. Low yeast nutrients will also be a problem because the yeast will produce a lot more diacetyl than normal, and they will not be able to clean it all. And lactic acid bacteria, such as Pediococcus, are known to produce a lot of diacetyl. So to control it, we need to let fermentation finish, make sure that there are enough yeast nutrients, and practice good sanitation. So this is for diacetyl. The next flavor that or aroma we can have in a mead is floral. So it's defined as floral-like aromatics. It's perceived as flower blossom, perfume-like aroma and flavor. The causes are the honey variety choice, and the controls are select a honey variety with the desired varietal characteristics, not typically a fault, unless it's a honey variety that shouldn't have these characteristics. So this is for the floral flavor, aroma. The next aroma and flavor we're going to discuss about is fruity. So the definition is estery, which are byproducts from the yeast. It's perceived as a fruity aroma or flavor. It may include apples, banana, pear, grapes, strawberry, citrus, or any other fruit. The causes are usually high fermentation temperatures, yeast strain selection, weak and or nutrient deprived fermentation, high gravity, and the honey variety. The controls are to lower fermentation temperature, try a cleaner yeast strain, oxygenate the must sufficiently, reduce the regional gravity, pitch a sufficient quantity of yeast, and avoid yeast stress, and bottle condition and age mead longer at cellar temperature to reduce esters, and try a different variety of honey. This is to control esters. And the next is actually a mouthfeel. So harsh is actually a mouthfeel. Okay, it's usually not a flavor. Harsh is the definition of it is a rough, unpleasant flavor and finish on the palate. It's perceived as a rough, biting or stinging sensation in the mouth, and it's often with excessive bitterness. The causes are excessive acids, alcohols, and or tannins. The controls are look at the sources of acids, alcohols, and tannins in the mead, and see how can you control to reduce the harshness from these compounds. The next flavor we're going to discuss is metallic. Metallic is defined as containing metallic ions, especially iron. So it's perceived as the flavor of iron, copper coins, or even blood. The causes are contaminated water supply, excessive additives, corroded equipment, and equipment not properly cleaned or rinsed. To control, check your water for metallic ions, reduce the water salts, reduce nutrient additions, check the equipment for condition for rust, make sure stainless steel equipment is properly passivated, fully rinse with a sanitizer, and try to use reverse osmosis water to add salts as needed. So this is metallic. The next flavor is moldy. The definition is a mold-like character, or it can be TCA or cork taint, but not so much these days. It's perceived as stale, moldy, musty, cellar-like, earthy. It can be like compost, even have a mushroom aroma and flavors, wet cardboard, and old rag flavors. Causes can be oxidation, mold growth, stale water and ingredients, sealing with a cork, storage in musty barrels or containers. To control, avoid oxidation, check for sanitation, check for water, for freshness and taste, use fresh ingredients, and check for mold in corks and artificial corks. So this is for moldy flavor. And the next one will be phenolic. So phenolics are a large group of organic chemicals. They often have plastic, medicinal, or tar-like aromas. They can be perceived as spicy, smoky, as we know from beer, like from wheat beer, the clove is phenol, and smoke is usually phenols, but it can also have plastic, Band-Aid, medicinal, even burnt rubber, burnt tires kind of aromas, which are bad. The causes are infection with wild yeast most of the time. Some honey varieties, especially eucalyptus and buckwheat and black mangrove, might have some of these flavors. Some spices can be phenolic, and fruit and spice can also add an infection source that can cause phenolic flavors. Oak aging can introduce phenolics, and water sources can also introduce phenolics. So to control, check for infection, check the yeast strain and health, check honey variety to make sure that it doesn't come from there, and check for oak usage, and also check for the cleanliness of your water source. So this is for phenolics. Next, we're going to talk about sherry-like. So we talked about oxidation when it's cardboard-like, but here we're talking about sherry-like, which also comes from post-fermentation oxidation. But this time it's perceived as sherry, nutty, almond aromas and flavors, and it can possibly have an increased bitterness levels. But this is a positive aspect of oxidation. So the causes are oxidation introduced into the mead after the fermentation. And to control it, we need to check for sources of oxidation being introduced into the mead after the fermentation is complete. So check all of the airlocks, don't splash when you're racking or bottling. Check the caps and keg seals for good fits. Purge bottles or kegs with CO2 prior to filling. Store the mead cool and drink the mead when it's fresh. So this is the sherry-like flavor. And next, we'll talk about solvent-like. So this is an off flavor, obviously. The definition are fusel alcohols and also ethyl acetate in high quantities, which is an ester. It's perceived as hot burning on the palate, harsh finish and aftertaste, can cause headaches. Then it can also have a nail polish remover of solvent, aroma, and flavor. The causes are mostly high fermentation temperatures, stress fermentation, acetobacter infection, and insufficient nutrients. To control, you should lower the fermentation temperatures, lower the fermentation temperatures, pitch a sufficient quantity of healthy active yeast, check for infections, try a different yeast strain, ensure sufficient nitrogen nutrients are available for the yeast. So this is for solvent-like. The next flavor is sulfuric. So this is defined as hydrogen sulfide or sulfur dioxide. It's perceived as rotten eggs, burning matches, and other sulfur-based aromas and flavors. Generally, it will be unpleasant. The causes can be either from the yeast as a byproduct or from autolysis. Insufficient nutrients can make the yeast expel hydrogen sulfide. Sulfur compounds in the water can supply this aroma, or additives like potassium metabisulfate that we discussed. Oxidized sulfur compounds can also cause it, and excessive sulfite additions. To control it, provide sufficient yeast nutrients, check for infection, check for water, check with the water for excessive sulfates, check the yeast for health, check for yeast autolysis. So make sure that the yeast is not, the mead is not left too long on the yeast cake, and try another yeast strain and cut back on the sulfite additions. So this is for the sulfuric flavor. Now we'll discuss tannin and astringency. So tannin and astringency are defined as polyphenolic, astringent, bitter plant polyphenols that are either bind and participate or shrink the proteins. So it's perceived as astringent, mouth puckering, mouthfeel, lingering harshness, grape skin character, increased bitterness, and a dry finish. The causes are extraction of tannins from fruit most of the time, spices or other ingredients, excessive tannin additions, if we're using tannin powder, for example, the use of oak, and also the use of tea. To control, avoid using raw spices, fruit pits and fruit skins, and also reduce the tannin additions and use less oak in the mead. The next flavor, the next thing we're going to discuss is not a flavor, it's also a mouthfeel, and it's thin body. So the definition is lacking in body and also generally lacking in honey flavor and impact. And it's perceived as a thin palate, mouthfeel and finish, watery palate impression and body, and an insipid character. The causes are over attenuation, poor quality honey, over filtered or excessive finings. And to control, you can reduce the attenuation by selecting a different yeast strain, back sweeten with honey, use fewer adjuncts, try a different honey variety. You can, some people even add glycerin or glycerol syrup or wine finishing formula to give it more body. So this is what to offer when you encounter thin body in the mead. And the next off flavor we'll discuss is the vegetal off flavor. So now we're talking about the smell or taste of plants or green vegetables. It's perceived as cooked, canned, or rotten vegetables like cabbage, celery, onion, asparagus, or parsnips, aroma and flavors. The causes are bacterial infection in the must, and to control, encourage a fast, vigorous fermentation, use a healthy, active starter to reduce the lag time. And this usually these flavors develop because of time for bacterial contamination in the must before the yeast take over. Check for sanitation, check for aged, stale, or old ingredients. So this is for the vegetal flavor. And the next and last off flavor we'll discuss today is waxy. Waxy is quite distinct in mead. The definition is the characteristic flavor of beeswax. It's usually perceived as wax-like, like tallow or fatty flavor and aroma. The causes are some varieties of honey, oxidized or low quality honey containing excessive fatty acids. It will usually be a problem in the with the honey separation from the honeycomb. So it will be a problem back then. So to control it, try a different variety of honey or from a different supplier, filter the honey and avoid oxidation of the honey. The next one is yeasty. Will have a yeast-like character. This is perceived as a bready, sulfury, yeast-like aroma and flavor, and the causes are yeast in suspension. The controls use a more flocculent yeast strain, allow a yeast sufficient time to flocculate, filter mead or use clarifying agents, avoid carrying over too much yeast for the in the rackings. Age the mead longer and try a different yeast strain. So this is the end of the last presentation in the course. It's been an honor being your guide into understanding such a unique beverage as mead. And if you're here, please like and subscribe. It will help these videos reach to more people on the web. So that's it. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.